Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're diving into something extraordinary, the earliest written records of human civilization. These aren't just ancient texts, they're humanity's first attempts to make sense of existence itself, carved into clay long before the Egyptian pyramids ever touched the sky. Before we begin this journey together, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe, but only if this content genuinely resonates with you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something remarkable about connecting with people across continents, all of us drawn to the same ancient questions about our origins and what our ancestors truly understood. Get comfortable. Dim those lights, maybe turn on some white noise in the background, and let's explore what the Sumerian tablets actually tell us. Not what modern interpreters want them to say, but what they reveal in their own voice, through their own symbols, before Debunking Sitchin and the History Channel told us how to think about ancient gods from the stars. 1. The waters before creation. Our story doesn't begin with spacecraft descending from distant planets. It doesn't start with genetic laboratories or extraterrestrial mining operations. None of the sensational imagery that has captured modern imagination appears in these ancient sources. Instead, the Sumerian creation narrative opens with something far more primal: Nammu. Nammu wasn't a goddess in the way we typically imagine deities. Not a being with human form walking among mortals. Not a personality with preferences and emotions. Nammu represented something more fundamental. The primordial ocean, the cosmic sea existing before creation itself had meaning or form. To understand this concept, we need to understand the Sumerian relationship with water. These people settled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in flat alluvial plains where survival depended entirely on annual flooding. When the rivers flooded properly, depositing rich silt across the fields, harvests were abundant and cities prospered. When floods came at the wrong time or with wrong intensity, famine threatened and survival became uncertain. Water was life itself to the Sumerians, not metaphorically, but literally. So when they contemplated the origins of everything, they naturally conceived of water as the primal element, the creative matrix from which all existence emerged. Imagine not the emptiness of space as we understand it today, but emptiness existing before space itself, before dimensions, before up and down had any meaning. This was what the Sumerians attempted to describe with Nammu. A nothingness that simultaneously contained everything, a cosmic ocean holding all potential, but manifesting nothing, suspended in timeless waiting. Punus, the first generation, heaven and earth. The cuneiform tablets from Nippur, that sacred city in central Iraq, preserved texts dating to around 1600 BCE, but recording oral traditions thousands of years older. These sources describe Nammu as a self-generating creative force, a deity requiring no partner or consort to bring forth the universe. This detail carries profound significance. In most ancient mythologies, creation requires divine marriage, a union of opposites producing something new. The Sky Father mates with Earth Mother, and from their union comes the world. But the earliest Sumerian tradition described something different. Nammu was complete unto herself, containing both creative potential and the will to actualize it. From her essence, Nammu brought forth two beings: An, representing the sky, the vast celestial dome covering the earth, and Kai, embodying the earth itself, the solid foundation for all terrestrial life. These weren't fully anthropomorphic gods, with human faces and recognizable emotions. They were fundamental forces of nature, given divine status, cosmic principles personified, the basic architecture of reality itself. Initially, Anunnaki existed in unified embrace. Heaven and earth locked together in undifferentiated mass, with no space between them, no atmosphere, no realm where life could exist. Everything that would eventually populate the cosmos existed only as potential within this primordial unity. 3. Enlil's violent creation. From the union of Anunnaki came Enlil, whose name translates approximately as Lord of the Air, or Master of Breath. Enlil's role in shaping the cosmos as we know it was absolutely fundamental, and necessarily violent. Creation couldn't proceed through gentle evolution. It required rupture, forceful separation of what had been unified. Enlil thrust the sky upward, pushing An away from Kai, and in that violent act created the space between them. The air, the atmosphere, the realm where weather happens and birds fly and humans breathe. This separation was the true beginning of the ordered cosmos. The moment when potential became actual, when undifferentiated unity gave way to the multiplicity and diversity we experience, and rose upward to establish his domain in the celestial realm. Ki remained below, and Enlil claimed the space between them, the air, the wind, the breath of life itself, as his particular kingdom. This three-tiered structure, heaven, earth, and the air between, formed the fundamental cosmological framework of Sumerian thought. Simple in some respects, yet capturing something essential about the observable world, the unreachable sky above, home to sun, moon, and stars that govern time and seasons, the earth below, realm of human activity and agricultural labour, and the invisible but essential air between, the medium through which rain falls and breath moves. Chose 4, the time before time. Here's where the texts reveal something absolutely fascinating. They describe a period before Enlil's separation, a time the Sumerians themselves struggled to articulate, a period for which they lacked adequate vocabulary or conceptual frameworks. The tablets speak of a time when only water existed, when boundaries between salt water and fresh water hadn't been established, when the cosmic ocean was undifferentiated and all-encompassing. In later Babylonian texts, like the Enuma Elish, composed perhaps 1,000 years after the earliest Sumerian narratives, this primordial water split into two distinct beings. Apsu, representing fresh underground water emerging in springs and wells, and Tiamat, embodying the salt water of the sea. Their mingling produced the first generation of gods in Babylonian tradition. But in the older Sumerian tradition, Nammu preceded even this division. She was the totality of primordial waters before any distinction had been made, suggesting a more monistic cosmology than later versions, ultimate reality emerging from a single source rather than dualistic interaction. 5. Eridu, the first city. Archaeological evidence supports the profound antiquity of these beliefs. The city of Eridu in southern Iraq, near what was once the Persian Gulf shoreline, was considered by the Sumerians themselves as the oldest city in the world, the first place where kingship descended from heaven, the birthplace of civilization itself. Modern excavations confirm that Eridu represents one of the earliest urban settlements in human history, with occupation dating back to approximately 5400 BCE, making it contemporary with, or even older than the famous site of Uruk to the north. Eridu's patron deity was Enki, god of wisdom, fresh water, creation, crafts, and magical knowledge. Enki occupied a special place in the Sumerian pantheon, often portrayed as cleverer than other gods, more willing to help humanity, less bound by rigid divine hierarchies. He was, in some respects, a trickster figure who worked around the decrees of more powerful but less imaginative gods. Enki's temple at Eridu bore the name Abzu, literally House of the Cosmic Deep Waters. This wasn't merely poetic symbolism. The temple was believed built upon the very spot where primordial waters first emerged into the terrestrial world, where the boundary between the cosmic ocean beneath all land and the realm of human habitation was thinnest. Priests conducting rituals there believed they stood nothing less than the axis of creation, the point where the ordered world of civilization touched the primal chaos that preceded it, and still existed beneath the thin veneer of order. 6. The cosmic ocean below. The Sumerians conceived their world as resting upon and emerging from a cosmic ocean of fresh water. This wasn't abstract theology disconnected from reality. It was grounded in actual environmental experience. The Mesopotamian plain features a remarkably high water table. Whenever the Sumerians dug deep enough, they invariably found water. From this consistent empirical observation, repeated countless times across generations, they constructed a cosmology where the entire world floated upon primordial waters, where dry land was essentially an island in an infinite ocean. The sky above was conceived as a solid dome, perhaps crystalline, arching over earth and keeping the waters above from falling down and drowning the world. Below earth stretched the Abzu, endless subterranean waters from which all springs, rivers, and wells ultimately flowed. This cosmological model made profound sense given Sumerian experience of catastrophic floods. When the Tigris and Euphrates overflowed simultaneously, the flat plains transformed into an inland sea. During such floods, documented in archaeological layers at multiple sites, the world literally returned to a watery state, with only raised hills where cities stood remaining above floodwaters. The Sumerian flood myth preserved the traumatic memory of such catastrophic events, elevated to cosmic and theological significance, which we'll explore in greater detail shortly. 7. The Divine Generations. The text preserved in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, a magnificent scholarly resource making thousands of compositions available in English translation, provide remarkably detailed descriptions of the early cosmic order and the generations of gods who populated it. They speak of a time when gods themselves were born into this newly ordered world, when the divine pantheon took shape through divine births and sexual unions, when the empty spaces created by Enlil's separation began filling with divine inhabitants. But here's where the timeline becomes absolutely crucial. The Anunnaki, according to actual Sumerian texts, when read carefully in their original language, were not the first gods. They weren't even the second generation. They appear relatively late in divine genealogy, offspring of already established gods, members of the third or fourth generation depending on how we count. The word Anunnaki itself, contrary to popular modern interpretations promoted by ancient astronaut theorists, does not mean those who came down from heaven to earth, or those who from heaven came. This translation has become almost canonical in pseudo-archaeological circles, but it's simply incorrect, either through misunderstanding of Sumerian grammar, or deliberate mistranslation designed to support predetermined conclusions about ancient astronauts. The term actually derives from Sumerian elements, translating more accurately as princely blood, seed of An, or offspring of the prince, referring to their status as descendants of An, the sky god whose name literally means heaven. Every reputable Sumerian dictionary, every scholarly analysis, every expert who has devoted their career to this ancient language confirms this etymological derivation. The Anunnaki were understood as a group of deities, powerful gods certainly, but gods who emerged from the cosmological framework that already existed, who were born into a divine hierarchy predating them by at least 2 generations. 8. The early pantheon. Before the Anunnaki entered mythological narrative in their later well-defined roles. The texts describe a world populated by other divine beings, gods emerging directly from the primordial state, who established the fundamental patterns of existence. The earliest gods included not just An, Ki, and Enlil, but also Nana, the moon god, whose monthly cycle governed the Mesopotamian calendar, and whose temple at was one of the most important religious centres in ancient Sumer. Utu, the sun god, who brought light and warmth to the world, associated with justice and truth because the sun's light revealed everything hidden, whose daily journey across the sky marked the passage of time. Inana, perhaps the most complex and fascinating goddess in the entire pantheon, deity of love and warfare, fertility and destruction. The planet Venus, whose appearance as both morning and evening star made her seem like two different entities. Inanna embodied the fundamental Sumerian understanding that creation and destruction were intimately linked, that life and death were two faces of the same cosmic reality. These deities, along with many others whose names fill surviving god lists and hymns, established the fundamental patterns of existence long before the Anunnaki appeared as a distinct group. They created the cycles of day and night through celestial movements. They established seasons through annual flooding and stellar movements. They governed natural phenomena upon which Sumerian life absolutely depended. Rain, storms, gentle breezes. 9. The Antediluvian kings, the Sumerian king list. One of the most fascinating and puzzling documents from ancient Mesopotamia, provides an intriguing window into the period before familiar historical narrative begins. This document, composed during the third dynasty of around 2100 BCE, but drawing on much older sources, begins with a remarkable statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This opening establishes kingship itself, centralized political authority exercised by a single ruler, as a divine institution rather than human invention. Kingship didn't emerge from social contracts or tribal evolution. It descended from heaven, a gift from the gods, appearing fully formed as a divinely ordained system. But then, the king list does something extraordinary that has puzzled scholars since its discovery. It names 8 kings who ruled before the Great Flood, Antediluvian rulers whose reigns stretched across seemingly impossible spans of time. These 8 rulers governed 5 cities in succession: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Their combined reigns totaled an astonishing 200 years. The first of these kings, Alulim, who ruled in Eridu, reigned for 28,800 years. Just consider that number. Longer than all recorded human history, longer than the entire period of human agriculture, longer than the existence of any known city or civilization. His successor, Alaugar, reigned for 36,000 years. The third king, Enmenluana, ruled for 43,200 years. Modern scholars have naturally struggled to make sense of these numbers. Some suggest they should be understood symbolically rather than literally, representing qualities or achievements. Others propose the term, translated as year, might have represented a different time unit, months or even days, which would reduce these reigns to more reasonable lengths when recalculated. But there's another possibility. These antediluvian rulers may have been understood as existing in a fundamentally different temporal framework than post-flood kings, inhabiting mythological time, operating according to different principles than historical time. The Sumerian texts repeatedly emphasize a sharp distinction between the world before the flood and after it, treating them as fundamentally different epochs with different cosmic conditions. Before the deluge, the texts suggest through various indicators time itself flowed differently. Life operated on different principles, with lifespans extended far beyond what would later become normal. The boundary between divine and mortal realms was less rigid, allowing direct contact and interaction that would become increasingly rare in the post-flood world. 10. The cities of the Golden Age. The cities themselves carry deep significance. Eridu, as we've discussed, was the first city, the place where civilization began, the location of Enki's temple built over cosmic waters, representing the ideal city from which all others derived. Bad Tibira, whose name translates approximately as Wall of the Copper Worker or Fortress of the Metal Workers, was associated particularly with metallurgy and craft production, with technological innovations that transformed human life. The discovery of metalworking, the ability to extract copper from ore and shape it into tools and weapons, represented a revolutionary development in human culture. Larak's significance is less clear from surviving texts, though it appears in various incantations and rituals associated with healing and purification, suggesting special connection to these practices. Sipa was sacred to Utu, the sun god associated with justice and truth, and housed one of the most important temples in all ancient Mesopotamia, a centre of learning and law where scribes were trained and legal decisions made. Shuruppak, the final antediluvian city, would become famous as the home of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, and as the city where the flood began, the last city to exist before the cosmic catastrophe ended the Antediluvian world. What do these cities and their impossibly long-reigning kings tell us? They suggest a graduated cosmology, a sophisticated view of time and existence, moving from purely divine realm through intermediate stages toward the fully human world the Sumerians inhabited. The Antediluvian period represented a time when gods and humans, or perhaps godlike beings and human-like beings, existed in much closer proximity than would later be possible. Kingship had descended from heaven, meaning rulership was understood as divine gift and sacred responsibility. But the kings exercising this heavenly gift in earliest times were not fully human in the way later rulers would be. They were transitional figures existing at the boundary between divine and mortal, partaking of both natures, able to live for thousands of years because they possessed divine qualities ordinary humans lacked. Their extreme lifespans marked them as exceptional, fundamentally different from post-flood kings, belonging to a different order of being. This is mythological thinking in its purest form, using chronology and genealogy to express theological and cosmological ideas, tracing the gradual movement from divine to human, from eternal to temporal, from myth to history. 11. The creation of humanity. A crucial Sumerian text called Enki and Ninmah provides detailed information about humanity's creation, information predating and providing essential context for any later stories about the Anunnaki's involvement with human beings. This remarkable composition describes a time when the gods, specifically the lesser or junior gods occupying lower ranks of the divine hierarchy, were burdened with backbreaking work of creation and cosmic maintenance. They dug canals to channel water for irrigation. They piled up silt to create foundations for temples and cities. They crushed clay to make bricks for building. And they complained bitterly about their toil, about endless labour leaving them exhausted and miserable. In those days, in the days when heaven and earth were created, the text begins, establishing the deep antiquity of events it describes. In those nights, in the nights when heaven and earth were created, in those years when the fates were determined, when the Inuna gods were born. This opening situates the story at the very beginning of cosmic time, immediately after reality's basic structure had been established, but before the world had taken its final form. The senior gods, great deities like An and Enlil, holding supreme positions in the divine hierarchy, oversaw the work while minor gods bore the actual toil, performing physical labour the cosmic order required. This divine hierarchy, with its stark division between gods who commanded and gods who laboured, existed before humanity entered the picture, before humans had been created to serve any purpose whatsoever. The text tells us that Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, lay sleeping in the deep waters of the Abzu, completely unaware of the complaints and suffering of the labouring gods. His mother Nammu gathered the tears of these suffering divine beings and brought them to her son, rousing him from his sleep to address this problem threatening to disrupt cosmic order. "Can you really lie there sleeping?" she asked him, "while the gods groan under their labour, while their tears fall uncollected, while cosmic order teeters on the edge of revolt?" Enki's solution was both ingenious and fateful. He proposed creating a substitute workforce, beings who would relieve gods of their back-breaking labour, who would take over agricultural and construction work necessary to maintain the cosmos, but that gods found so burdensome. Working in collaboration with Nammu and with the birth goddess Ninmah, also known as Ninhursag and Nintu, Enki fashioned the first humans from clay taken from atop the Abzu, from the primordial waters themselves, from the same cosmic substance that had existed before creation. This detail about clay coming from the Abzu is profoundly significant for understanding what Sumerians believed about human nature and origins. Humanity was formed from the most primal substance available, from clay infused with the essence of cosmic waters predating all ordered existence. We weren't made from lesser or degraded material, not assembled from corpses of defeated demons as in some other ancient Near Eastern myths, but crafted from the same primordial stuff from which the gods themselves had emerged. The birth goddesses, divine midwives skilled in creating life, nipped off portions of this sacred clay. Through a process the text describes in somewhat obscure terms involving divine spittle and perhaps blood, human beings came into existence. This creation narrative predates and provides essential context for any later stories about the Anunnaki's role in human affairs. Before the Anunnaki were described in Debunking Sitchin's books as creating humans through genetic manipulation to mine gold, before modern theories about slave species and DNA splicing and extraterrestrial intervention, there was this older, more authentic Sumerian tradition. Humanity was created for a specific purpose, certainly, but that purpose was agricultural labour and temple maintenance, not mining operations or resource extraction for alien overlords. The motivation was practical from the divine perspective, relieving gods of work they found burdensome. But the process was sacred, involving divine collaboration, primordial materials, and transfer of something essential from the divine realm to the mortal sphere. Humans were formed from primordial clay mixed with divine essence, making them participants in both the earthly realm of matter and the cosmic realm of spirit. This dual nature, neither fully natural like animals nor fully divine like gods, would define humanity's special and often uncomfortable position in the Sumerian worldview. 12. The Divine Contest. The text of Enki and Ninmah continues with a curious episode demonstrating the experimental nature of this early creation, showing gods working through trial and error to discover proper form and function for human beings. After successfully making functional humans capable of performing required agricultural labour, after demonstrating this new solution actually worked, Enki and Ninmah engage in a contest, a divine competition where each tries to create beings with various deficiencies or unusual characteristics, challenging the other to find appropriate roles for them in society. Ninmah creates people who are blind, unable to see the work they're supposed to do. She creates people who are paralysed, unable to move their limbs to perform labour. She creates people with various other physical impairments, each presenting a challenge to the divine plan for human utility. And Enki, demonstrating his characteristic wisdom and adaptability, finds appropriate roles for each of them in society, showing that even those who cannot perform standard agricultural labour have value and can contribute to community in other ways. Then Enki takes his turn, creating beings with his own peculiar characteristics, strange entities pushing the boundaries of what human means, and challenges Ninmah to care for them and find their place in cosmic order. This story, strange and perhaps even disturbing to modern sensibilities, preferring creation narratives to describe perfect divine acts producing perfect results, actually addresses profound questions about disability, purpose, social inclusion, and the place of all humans in cosmic order. Not just those who are healthy and able-bodied. It reflects a theological worldview that didn't see creation as a single perfect act producing an ideal final form, but as an ongoing process subject to adjustment and improvement, requiring experimentation and adaptation. It shows gods who are creative and adaptable, who learn and problem solve, who engage actively with creation rather than simply decreeing it into existence from aloof omnipotence. This experimental, process-oriented approach stands in stark contrast to the ancient astronaut interpretation typically portraying humanity's creation as deliberate genetic engineering carried out according to predetermined plans with specific goals clearly defined from the start. The Sumerian text presents something far more nuanced and sophisticated, divine craftsmanship involving learning, trial and error, creative problem-solving, and ongoing refinement as gods discovered what worked and what didn't. 13. The Gifts of Civilization. Another crucial text called The Debate Between Sheep and Grain provides additional context for understanding early human existence before civilization reached its developed form, before gifts making urban life possible had been granted to humanity. This composition describes the world before agriculture had been established, before domestication of animals had transformed human diet and economy, before establishment of productive economic systems, characterizing Sumerian cities. In the beginning, the text tells us, Earth was barren, offering nothing to sustain human life. There was no grain growing in fields, no wheat or barley that could be harvested and ground into flour for bread. There were no sheep providing wool for clothing and milk for nourishment. No goats, no cattle. People went naked because they had no fibres to weave into cloth, no hides to tan into leather, no protection from sun and cold except what they could improvise from reeds and wild plants. They ate grass for nourishment like animals, chewing tough wild plants that filled bellies but provided little real sustenance, drinking water from ditches and streams without benefit of wells or irrigation systems. This was humanity in its most primitive state. Humans existed certainly, but lived barely above animal level, without tools and techniques allowing them to transcend natural limitations and create something new. Then, according to the text, the gods Ashnan and Lahar, who personified grain and sheep respectively, were created specifically to provide sustenance for humanity, to lift humans from their primitive state and enable them to live more comfortably, securely, abundantly. The establishment of agriculture, cultivation of wheat and barley, and domestication of sheep and goats represented a transformation in human existence, a movement from bare survival, where every day was a struggle to find enough food, to a condition of productive culture, where surpluses could be generated, stored, redistributed, supporting labour specialisation and city growth. This transformation, according to Sumerian texts when read attentively, occurred through divine intervention, through deliberate choice of gods to improve human conditions, to grant humans the knowledge and resources needed to build something approaching civilization. This wasn't biological evolution slowly changing human capabilities over millions of years. It was cultural development, transmission of knowledge and technique from divine realm to mortal sphere, happening relatively quickly in cosmic time, if not human time, transforming existence within a few generations. 14. The organization of the cosmos. The text Enki and the World Order provides an even broader picture of how the cosmos was organized in this early period after creation, but before the historical era archaeology can document directly. According to this lengthy composition, Enki surveyed the newly created world after basic structure had been established, after heaven and earth had been separated, gods born, humans created, and recognized that proper management was essential. The cosmos, even though created and ordered, required constant divine oversight to avoid falling back into chaos, so Enki, acting with authority granted by An and with cooperation of other major deities, assigned various gods to oversee different aspects of cosmic existence, creating essentially a divine bureaucracy with clear chains of command and areas of responsibility. One deity was given responsibility for sweet waters flowing from springs and running in rivers, ensuring irrigation systems would function properly, that drought wouldn't destroy crops, that life-giving water would continue flowing from mountains to plains. Another god oversaw crops and agriculture generally, making sure fields produced yields in proper season, that seeds germinated, plants grew, harvests came at expected times. Yet another divine being managed construction and building projects, overseeing brick-making, wall-raising, temple construction connecting earth to heaven. Others controlled wildlife, keeping animals in proper places, preventing them from overrunning human settlements or destroying crops. Domestic animals had their divine overseer, ensuring flocks and herds thrived and multiplied. Even women's activities, particularly weaving, spinning, cloth making, had a goddess assigned to supervise and protect them. This elaborate text reveals a Sumerian understanding of the world as requiring constant divine maintenance rather than operating automatically once set in motion. The cosmos didn't simply run on autopilot after creation. It needed active management, divine attention paid to every domain of existence, continuous oversight of specialized deities, ensuring each sphere of reality functioned properly. This is a much more complex and sophisticated picture than the simple narrative often presented in ancient astronaut literature, where gods create humans for a specific purpose, then largely withdraw from daily involvement except when their interests are threatened. The Sumerians saw their world as continuously sustained by divine activity, with gods actively involved in ongoing operations of nature and civilization, present in every aspect of life, from river flooding to childbirth to military campaign success. 15. The Anunnaki's true role. What role did the Anunnaki play in this elaborate divine organizational structure? The texts describe them as a collective group, offspring of An, as we've established, who function primarily as judges and determiners of fate rather than as managers of natural processes or civilizational activities. They were associated particularly with the underworld, that dark realm beneath earth where all mortals eventually travelled after death, and with determination of human destinies, the fixing of fates governing what would happen to each individual soul. In the famous story of Inanna's descent to the underworld, one of the most powerful and moving compositions in all Sumerian literature, the Anunnaki appear in their characteristic role as the 7 judges who condemn the great goddess to death in the realm of the dead. When Inanna descends into the underworld to attend her sister's husband's funeral, When she passes through 7 gates and loses an item of divine power at each one until she arrives naked and powerless before Ereshkigal's throne, the Anunnaki sit in judgment. They fasten their eyes of death upon her, and she dies, hanging as a corpse on a hook for 3 days, until rescued by clever beings Enki creates to retrieve her. This episode portrays the Anunnaki not as creators or managers of human civilization, not as technological beings with advanced capabilities, but as authorities over final judgment, the ultimate fate awaiting all beings, mortal and divine. They're respected and feared for this power, certainly, but they're not the focus of creation narratives or primary actors in organizing the cosmos. They occupy a specific niche in the divine hierarchy, performing an essential function, but not the founding or creative function that ancient astronaut theory attributes to them. 16. The Great Flood. The antediluvian cities and their long-lived kings represented, in mythological understanding, the first implementation of divine social order. When kingship descended from heaven and was established in Eridu, it brought not just political authority, but an entire package of civilizational technologies, practices, and institutions. But this age of close divine-human contact was fundamentally unstable. It ultimately ended by divine decree through the catastrophe of the flood. The Eridu Genesis, the oldest surviving narrative of the Great Deluge, provides crucial details about this transitional moment in cosmic history, about destruction of the old order and establishment of the new. The text, preserved on a badly damaged cuneiform tablet, from which about 2/3 of content has been lost, begins with a description of creation paralleling other Sumerian cosmogonic texts. The gods created humanity, the black-headed people as Sumerians called themselves, and gave them fundamental gifts of civilization. Cities were founded across fertile Mesopotamian plains and placed under patronage of specific deities serving as protectors and benefactors. Eridu belonged to Enki. Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak each received their patron gods. But then something went profoundly wrong. Humanity multiplied across the fertile plains, filling cities with activity and commerce and daily life. They prospered under divine protection. And their noise, the constant tumult of human activity, the clamour of crowded cities full of people going about their business, disturbed the gods dwelling in temples and celestial palaces. This detail is absolutely crucial for understanding Sumerian theology and the divine-human relationship. The gods didn't decide to destroy humanity because humans were evil or sinful in a moral sense, because they'd violated divine commandments or fallen from initial grace. The motivation was much more mundane and, in some ways, more disturbing. Humans were too numerous, too successful, too vibrant with life. They filled the world with noise, keeping gods awake, disturbing divine peace and tranquility. Enlil, the powerful god of air and storms holding supreme authority over earth after separating heaven from earth at creation's beginning, found himself unable to sleep because of constant tumult of human civilization. The cities were too crowded, he complained to the divine assembly. Humans were too loud, too busy, too present, everywhere. Their noise rose to the heavens, making rest impossible, turning what should have been peaceful divine existence into an ordeal of constant disturbance. After consulting with other senior gods and receiving their grudging agreement, Enlil made the catastrophic decision to destroy humanity with a great flood sweeping over the land, wiping away cities and their noisy inhabitants, returning the world to the quiet primordial state it had enjoyed before humans multiplied so abundantly. This is a strikingly anthropomorphic motivation for cosmic catastrophe, showing gods who act from irritation and desire for comfort rather than abstract justice or cosmic necessity. 17. Enki's subversion. But one god disagreed. Enki, the lord of wisdom and sweet water, the clever god often appearing in texts as more sympathetic to humanity than his peers, believed total destruction was excessive punishment for the crime of being too numerous and noisy. He recognised humans served a useful purpose, performing agricultural labour gods themselves had found burdensome, maintaining temples, making offerings, sustaining divine existence in the mortal realm. Eliminating them entirely would force gods back to the very labour problem that had motivated human creation in the first place. The texts portray Enki as a trickster figure in this episode, clever and subversive, willing to circumvent decrees of more powerful but less imaginative gods when he believed they were making a terrible mistake. He couldn't openly defy Enlil's decree, couldn't stand before the divine assembly and argue for humanity's preservation, because the decision had already been made and divine decrees were understood as irrevocable once pronounced. But he could work around it, finding loopholes, using his characteristic cunning to achieve his goals without directly violating divine law's letter. Enki appeared to Ziusudra, king of Shrupak, the last of the Antediluvian rulers. Different versions describe this crucial revelation in slightly different ways. In some, Enki comes to Ziusudra in a dream. In others, he positions himself on one side of a reed wall forming part of Ziusudra's house, speaking loudly as if talking to the wall itself, while Ziusudra, on the other side, overhears without Enki technically having made direct communication. This elaborate subterfuge, this careful manoeuvring around technicalities of divine law, shows Sumerian gods as bound by their own rules and precedents, not operating with complete freedom to do whatever they wish at any moment. The message Enki delivered was absolutely clear and urgent. A flood was coming. The assembly of gods had decreed humanity's destruction. The decision was final, irrevocable, beyond appeal. But you can save yourself, Enki continued. Save your family. Save representatives of all living species. Save the seed of civilization so the world can be repopulated after the waters recede. Build a great boat, he instructed, giving specifications about its construction that the damaged state of the tablet has unfortunately rendered largely illegible. Make it watertight. Load it with animals. Prepare provisions for the coming catastrophe. The text provides tantalizing details about this vessel's construction in the portions that survive, though frustratingly, key sections are lost due to damage to the clay tablet. We know Ziusudra built the boat according to Enki's divine instructions, working presumably with help from family members and perhaps trusted servants who could keep the project secret. He loaded the boat with representatives of all animal species, both wild and domestic, ensuring the diversity of life would survive. He gathered provisions, food and water sufficient to sustain both humans and animals through however many days or weeks the deluge would last. Then, with preparations complete and the boat sealed against coming waters, the flood arrived with a violence the text describes in vivid and terrifying terms that have lost none of their power despite being recorded on clay 4,000 years ago. All the evil winds gathered together, every stormy blast from every direction converging into a single catastrophic force. The flood swept over the cities of the half-bushel baskets, that poetic phrase referring to standard units of measure used in Sumerian trade and commerce, indicating these were the productive centres of civilization being destroyed. For 7 days and 7 nights the deluge continued without pause. The massive boat tossed about on the great waters like a toy, while outside the world drowned. The cities humanity had built with such tremendous effort over generations, those centres of civilization where temples rose to the heavens and markets bustled with trade and scribes recorded transactions in newly invented writing, were submerged and destroyed. The ordered world the gods had established after separating heaven from earth, the cosmos of cultivated fields and irrigation canals and urban streets, was temporarily undone, returned to the primordial state of chaos and undifferentiated waters that had existed before creation. Everything humanity had achieved, every monument they had raised, every innovation they had developed, seemed to be wiped away as if it had never existed. 18 after the storm. When the storm finally ended, after that terrible week of wind and rain and rising water, when the fury of the flood exhausted itself, and waters began very slowly to recede, Ziusudra opened a window in the great boat to see what remained of the world. The sun god Utu, who had been hidden behind storm clouds for 7 days and nights, now sent his blessed light into the vessel's dark interior, illuminating the space where Ziusudra and his family and all the animals had huddled together, waiting for the catastrophe to end. Ziusudra emerged onto the deck, or possibly onto newly revealed land. We're not entirely certain, because the text is damaged at this crucial point, and immediately his first action was to perform sacrifices to the gods. He butchered oxen as offerings to the divine powers who had both decreed the flood and provided means of survival. He lavished sheep, presenting multiple animals as thanksgiving for deliverance. He prepared barley cakes and crescent-shaped bread as offerings, traditional foods associated with religious ritual. He burned juniper, that pure plant of the mountains, whose fragrant smoke was believed particularly pleasing to gods. This detail about immediate sacrifice, about worship and thanksgiving being Ziusudra's first priority after surviving the apocalypse, is profoundly important for understanding the Sumerian religious worldview. Even though the gods, specifically Enlil, had decreed humanity's complete destruction, even though divine action had caused the catastrophe that killed everyone except this single family and their animal cargo, the proper response of the survivor was worship and propitiation and thanksgiving. The Sumerian worldview didn't include a concept of gods as purely benevolent protectors who always acted in humanity's best interest. The divine powers were recognized as capricious, sometimes helpful and sometimes hostile, sometimes preserving life, and sometimes destroying it according to their own inscrutable purposes. But they were always deserving of respect and worship, always demanding propitiation regardless of their actions, because they were gods and humans were utterly dependent on their favour. 19. Divine reconciliation. The text of the Eridu Genesis breaks off after describing these sacrifices, with large portions lost to damage. But we can reconstruct what must have followed from later versions of the flood story preserved in the Atrahasis epic, and in the flood narrative incorporated into the Epic of Gilgamesh. Enlil discovered that humans had survived his attempted genocide, that his decree of total destruction had been subverted by Enki's clever intervention. He was absolutely furious. His rage at being thwarted probably intensified by realization that another god had undermined his authority. Demanding to know which deity had revealed the secret of the coming flood and enabled a human to escape. Enki admitted his role, stepping forward before the divine assembly to accept responsibility and justify his actions. He argued that humanity deserved a chance to survive, that they had not committed some heinous crime deserving extinction, that they served useful purposes for the gods, that complete annihilation would have been excessive and ultimately counterproductive punishment for the relatively minor offence of being too numerous and making too much noise. The Assembly of Gods debated this crisis, argued about appropriate responses, considered the implications of Enki's defiance of Enlil's decree, and the survival of humanity against the supreme god of Earth's will. Eventually, through processes of divine negotiation and compromise the texts don't fully specify, they reached an accommodation. Humanity could continue to exist, but measures would be implemented to control their population and reduce the noise that had so disturbed Enlil in the first place. Some texts suggest this is when various biological and social limitations were imposed on human existence as divine punishment or population control measures. Mortality itself, which may not have been quite so absolute in the Antediluvian age when kings could rule for thousands of years, became a fixed and unavoidable condition of human existence. Human lifespans were deliberately reduced to reasonable lengths, perhaps only a century or so, rather than the multiple millennia antediluvian rulers had enjoyed. Women's fertility was regulated through divine decree, the texts suggest, through the institution of women who remained barren throughout their lives and through the tragically common deaths of infants before they reached maturity. These grim measures, which would cause such suffering in actual human experience, were attributed to divine policy, to deliberate decisions made by gods to keep human population from growing so large that noise would again become a problem. Some versions also mention the institution of wild animals who would attack and kill humans, and of diseases that would carry people off before their time, additional mechanisms for population control imposed by divine will. 20. Ziusudra's reward. Ziusudra himself received special treatment in recognition of his obedience and piety. His faithfulness in following Enki's instructions, even when they required tremendous effort, and must have seemed insane to observers. The gods granted him eternal life, transforming him from a mortal into something approaching divine status, making him one of the very few humans in Mesopotamian tradition who escaped death entirely. They allowed him to dwell in Dilmun, a mythical paradise located somewhere at the eastern edge of the known world, where the sun rises each morning, bringing light to dispel darkness. Dilmun appears in multiple Sumerian texts as a pure and pristine land, a place of peace and abundance, completely free from disease and death, and all afflictions plaguing ordinary mortal existence. It's described as a place where no lion kills, where no wolf snatches lambs, where old age and illness are unknown concepts, where life continues in perfect harmony without the conflict and suffering characterizing existence in the normal world. By placing Ziusudra there after the flood, the gods removed him from ordinary human society, preserving him as a living link to the antediluvian past, as someone who could testify to what the world was like before the catastrophe, but who would not interfere with the new post-flood order. 21. Archaeological evidence. Archaeological evidence provides fascinating context for these textual traditions, grounding the mythology in actual historical events, even while recognizing that the stories themselves have been shaped by centuries of theological reflection and narrative development. Excavations at several Mesopotamian sites, including Shuruppak itself, the city named in the flood story as Ziusudra's home, have revealed clear evidence of significant flooding events dating to around 2000 BCE, right at the transition between the Jemdet-Nasr period and the early dynastic period when Sumerian civilization was consolidating and city-states were emerging as the dominant form of political organization. At Shuruppak, archaeologists discovered a substantial layer of riverine sediments deposited by floodwaters, interrupting the continuity of settlement and suggesting the city was temporarily abandoned after a major inundation before being reoccupied and rebuilt. Similar flood layers from approximately the same time period have been found at other early Sumerian cities, including Kish in the north and in the south, indicating this was a regional phenomenon affecting multiple sites rather than a localized event at a single city. The flood deposits don't represent a worldwide deluge in the geological sense, of course. They're evidence of catastrophic but geographically limited flooding events in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, probably caused by exceptional combinations of heavy rain in the mountains, where both rivers originated, and high river levels from spring snowmelt arriving at the plains simultaneously. But for the people who experienced these floods directly, who watched the rivers overflow their banks and spread across the flat plains for miles in every direction, who saw their fields and homes and temples submerged underwater, who had to flee to higher ground or drown, these events would have seemed genuinely world-ending. The Mesopotamian plain was effectively the entire world as far as these early Sumerians were concerned. They had no knowledge of distant continents or far-off lands. When the familiar landscape disappeared underwater and everything recognizable was destroyed, this was an apocalypse in the truest sense, an ending of the world as they knew it. The Sumerian flood myth preserves the traumatic memory of these catastrophic events, transforming them from natural disasters into theological narratives explaining why such terrible things happened and what they meant for humanity's relationship with the divine realm. 22. The three-tiered cosmos. Let's examine more closely the cosmological framework the Sumerian texts establish, because understanding this framework is absolutely essential for properly contextualizing the Anunnaki and all other divine beings within Sumerian theology. The Sumerians conceived of the universe as having three main levels or realms: a vertical structure organizing all existence into distinct but interconnected domains. At the top was Ain, heaven, the domain of the sky god whose name was identical with the realm he ruled, the celestial sphere far above earth, where sun and moon and stars moved in their eternal courses. This uppermost realm was the source of rain-making agriculture possible, of storms that could destroy or nourish depending on intensity, of all celestial phenomena governing the rhythms of time and seasons. It was the dwelling place of the most powerful gods, particularly An himself, who rarely intervened directly in earthly affairs, but whose authority was acknowledged by all other deities. Heaven was remote, unreachable by ordinary humans, separated from the mortal world by an unbridgeable gap, yet intimately connected to earth through weather and through divine will shaping events below. In the middle was Kyrie, the earth, the solid ground where humans and animals and plants existed, the manifest world of forms and activities. This was the realm of human civilization, where cities were built and fields cultivated, where daily life unfolded under the watchful eyes of the gods. The earth wasn't simply a passive stage where events happened. It was itself a divine being in some texts. The goddess Kai, who had been separated from her consort An by their son Enlil, who continued to sustain life through her fertility and stability. But the earth wasn't conceived as a simple flat surface floating in empty space. The Sumerians understood the earth as resting upon or surrounded by water, specifically by the Abzu, that cosmic ocean of fresh water we discussed earlier as Enki's domain. This subterranean realm of primordial waters represented the third major division of the cosmos, distinct from both heaven above and earth's surface. The Abzu wasn't the underworld in the sense of the land of the dead, though the two concepts were related and sometimes overlapped in mythological geography. The Abzu was specifically the realm of fresh water, the cosmic deep from which all springs and wells and rivers ultimately flowed. It was the source of fertility and life, providing the irrigation water making Mesopotamian agriculture possible. Enki dwelt in the Abzu in a magnificent palace adorned with precious stones and metals, ruling over this primordial ocean, controlling the flow of waters sustaining existence on Earth's surface. 23. The complexity of heaven and underworld. This three-tiered cosmology was actually more complex than it might initially appear. The text described the sky not as a single solid dome, but as multiple layers stacked one above another. Usually three heavens, but sometimes 7 in more elaborate cosmological schemes, each made of a different precious stone, giving it distinctive characteristics. The lowest dome of heaven, the one visible to humans looking upward from Earth, was made of jasper. This lowest heaven housed the stars, those points of light appearing at night that Sumerians recognized as following regular patterns across the sky, patterns that could be used to mark the passage of seasons and to navigate across trackless deserts. The middle dome of heaven was made of a stone the Sumerians called sagalmut, though we're not entirely certain what mineral this refers to in modern geological terms. This middle heaven was the dwelling place of the Igigi, a class of gods associated with celestial phenomena and with the work of maintaining cosmic order, somewhat junior to the great gods and the Anunnaki, but still divine beings worthy of respect. The highest dome of heaven, furthest from earth and closest to pure divinity, was where An himself dwelt in splendid isolation, presiding over all existence from his remote and exalted position. Below Earth's surface, in addition to the Abzu, with its life-giving fresh water, there was also the underworld proper, called Kur in Sumerian, or sometimes Irkala in later Akkadian traditions, the land of the dead, where all mortal souls eventually travelled regardless of how they had lived their earthly lives. This realm was ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, whose name means Lady of the Great Place Below, and by her consort Nergal, a god associated with war and pestilence and violent death. The underworld was consistently described in Sumerian texts as a dark and dreary place, a realm of dust and shadow where the dead existed in a grim parody of life. The dead in the Sumerian underworld ate only dust and clay, the most unappetizing substances imaginable, never enjoying the flavours of bread and beer and meat that had sustained them in life. They dwelt in darkness without the comforting light of sun or moon or stars. They wore feathers like birds, a curious detail appearing in multiple texts, perhaps suggesting their transformation into something inhuman and alien. They were separated forever from the warmth and light and joy of the upper world, condemned to this cheerless existence simply by virtue of being mortal and therefore subject to death. This underworld was not a place of punishment in the later Christian sense of hell, where sinners suffered torments proportional to their crimes. It was simply where all dead souls went, the inevitable destination of every mortal, regardless of moral character or achievements in life. The Sumerians had no concept of heaven as reward for righteousness or hell as punishment for wickedness. Death was the great equalizer, sending king and slave, saint and sinner, to the same grim subterranean realm. The quality of a person's afterlife depended not on their moral choices, but on whether their family continued to perform proper funerary rituals, pouring libations and making food offerings at their grave. 24. The Anunnaki as underworld judges. The Anunnaki occupied a very specific place within this cosmological framework, particularly associated with the underworld realm, with Kur, with the domain of the dead. They served as judges of the deceased, the 7 who decree, sitting in solemn assembly to determine the fate of each soul that entered the land of no return. This role is completely different from, and incompatible with, the ancient astronaut interpretation of the Anunnaki as spacefaring technologists, as aliens who came from another planet to exploit Earth's resources. The texts consistently portray them as chthonic deities, gods of Earth and underworld, associated with fate and judgment and the inexorable boundary between life and death, not with the heavens or with extraterrestrial origins. In Inanna's descent to the underworld, when the great goddess descends to attend her sister's husband's funeral, she must pass through 7 gates, surrendering an item of divine power at each one, her crown at the first gate, her necklace at the second, her breastplate at the third, continuing until she arrives naked and powerless before Ereshkigal's throne. The Anunnaki, described as the 7 judges, sit in assembly to hear the case against Inanna. They fasten their eyes of death upon her, that terrible gaze that strips away divine immortality and reduces even a goddess to a corpse. Inanna dies and is hung on a hook like a piece of meat, and for 3 days she remains dead until rescued by magical beings that Enki creates specifically to enter the underworld and retrieve her. This episode demonstrates that the Anunnaki's power in their own domain was absolute, able to kill even a great goddess, able to exercise judgment that the most powerful divine beings had to submit to. This portrayal is completely incompatible with the ancient astronaut interpretation. These are not technological beings with advanced equipment. They are chthonic judges, underworld authorities, beings whose power comes from their position at the ultimate boundary that all life must cross. They operate through supernatural judgment, through the eyes of death that kill by looking, not through any mechanism that could be described as technological or scientific in our modern understanding of those terms. 25. The ME, Divine Principles. The concept of the ME that appears in multiple Sumerian texts deserves extensive examination because it reveals how these ancient people understood the transmission of civilization, the establishment of social order, and the divine origins of cultural institutions. The ME were divine decrees or principles, fundamental patterns governing various aspects of civilized existence. Scholars have translated this Sumerian word in different ways, sometimes as divine powers, sometimes as cultural norms, sometimes as cosmic principles, reflecting the difficulty of capturing its full meaning in modern languages. Recent research has emphasized understanding the me not as abstract concepts but as actual practices, specific rituals and procedures that had to be performed correctly to maintain cosmic and social order. They were knowledge embodied in action, wisdom preserved through proper performance. The me included kingship itself, the right and ability to rule over others. They included priesthood, the specialized knowledge required to serve the gods properly in temples. They included truth and law, the principles of justice, allowing societies to function without descending into chaos. They included sexual intercourse and prostitution, both sacred and profane aspects of human reproduction and pleasure. The me encompassed art and music, the creative expressions making life more than mere survival. They included crafts and technologies, everything from metalwork to weaving to building construction. They included warfare and weapons, the martial arts allowing cities to defend themselves or conquer neighbours. They included descent into the underworld, suggesting that even the journey to death had to be undertaken according to proper procedure. The complete list of me, mentioned in various Sumerian texts, numbers more than 100 separate items, covering virtually every aspect of civilized human existence, from the most exalted to the most mundane. 26. Inanna steals the ME. In the myth called Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu to visit Enki in his temple built over the cosmic waters. Enki, being a hospitable god, and perhaps also being somewhat foolish when it comes to beautiful goddesses, entertains Inanna lavishly, plying her with beer and wine until his judgment is impaired. In his intoxicated state, he makes the catastrophic decision to give Inanna the me, transferring these fundamental principles of civilization from his possession to hers. The next morning, when sobriety returns and Enki realizes what he's done, he desperately tries to prevent Inanna from leaving Eridu with the me, sending his minister and various servants to intercept her and recover these precious divine powers. But Inanna and her servant Ninshubur cleverly evade these pursuers, making their way back to Uruk, where Inanna is the patron goddess, successfully transporting the me from Eridu to her own city. This mythological episode served to explain why Uruk, rather than Eridu, became the dominant city in early Sumerian history, why political and cultural power shifted from the oldest sacred centre to a newer but more dynamic urban centre. But it also reveals deeper truths about how the Sumerians understood civilization and its origins. Cultural knowledge, technological expertise, social institutions, all the things making urban life possible, were not human inventions emerging through trial and error over long periods. They were divine gifts, sacred knowledge that had to be properly transmitted and carefully preserved. The me had to be obtained from the gods who originally possessed them, acquired through some combination of divine favour, clever negotiation, and sometimes outright theft, as in Inanna's case. This theological understanding of culture's origins wasn't primitive superstition or failure to recognise human agency and innovation. It was a sophisticated way of acknowledging that civilization depended on accumulated knowledge passed down through generations, on techniques and practices that had to be learned rather than being innately known, on cultural inheritance that each generation received from ancestors and had responsibility to transmit to descendants. By attributing the me to divine origins, the Sumerians were emphasizing their sacred importance, protecting them from casual modification or thoughtless abandonment. 27. Temple economics. The temple complexes dominating Sumerian cities served as repositories and centres for the performance of the Me'is, institutions where this sacred knowledge was preserved and enacted through daily rituals and seasonal ceremonies. These weren't simply religious buildings in our modern sense, separate from economic and political activity. Sumerian temples were economic powerhouses, centres of production and redistribution, institutions managing vast agricultural estates, employing hundreds or thousands of workers in various capacities, collecting taxes and tribute, and distributing resources according to complex hierarchical systems. The temple dedicated to Inanna in Uruk, called the Inana, or House of Heaven, controlled enormous agricultural lands worked by dependent labourers who received rations of food and clothing in exchange for their work. The temple maintained workshops where specialised craftspeople produced textiles, pottery, metal goods, stone carvings, and countless other products. It operated as a major trading institution, exchanging Mesopotamian grain and manufactured goods for raw materials that weren't available locally, including timber from the mountains, stones for construction and sculpture, metals for tools and weapons, exotic items from distant lands. Archaeological excavations of temple complexes have revealed extensive archives, thousands of clay tablets recording economic transactions in meticulous detail. These texts list deliveries of grain from specific fields, distributions of rations to named individuals, inventories of livestock and tools and finished products, accounts of trade missions sent to distant regions. The sheer volume and complexity of this record-keeping demonstrates that Sumerian temples were managing sophisticated economic operations on a scale that required writing for effective administration. Indeed, writing itself developed precisely to meet these administrative needs, beginning as a tool for tracking economic flows before later expanding to record literature, history, laws, and religious texts. 28. The development of writing, which developed in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE, according to archaeological evidence, making it one of the world's earliest writing systems, along with the roughly contemporary Egyptian hieroglyphs. was initially a tool of economic administration rather than literary expression. The earliest Sumerian tablets archaeologists have discovered aren't religious hymns or mythological narratives or historical chronicles. They're accounting records, administrative documents tracking the mundane but essential flows of goods and labour that made urban civilization possible. These primitive texts list deliveries of barley from specific fields to temple granaries, sometimes with the names of the farmers or administrators responsible. They record distributions of bread and beer rations to named workers, documentation allowing temple overseers to ensure everyone received their proper allotment. They inventory livestock, counting sheep and goats and cattle, tracking their multiplication through births and their diminishment through deaths or sacrifices. They list tools and equipment, making sure that valuable metal implements weren't lost or stolen. They document the production of textiles, recording how much wool was delivered to workshops and how many finished garments were produced. Only later, once writing had been established as a practical administrative technology, did Sumerian scribes begin using this tool for other purposes. Religious hymns praising the gods and describing their attributes were among the first literary texts. Then came mythological narratives like the ones we've been examining, stories about creation and the flood and divine adventures. Legal codes appeared, systematizing the principles of justice and documenting penalties for various crimes. Historical texts emerged, recording the deeds of kings and the victories of armies. Wisdom literature developed, collections of proverbs and teachings designed to educate scribes and transmit cultural values. This trajectory from economic administration to literary and historical expression tells us something profound about Sumerian civilization and how it understood the relationship between the practical and the sacred. These were not separate domains in Sumerian thought. The temple was simultaneously a religious centre dedicated to worshipping the gods and an economic hub managing the productive resources of the community. The sacred and the practical were intimately intertwined, both essential aspects of the same civilizational project. 29. Divine kingship. The texts describe kingship as a mediating institution within this theological economic system. The king was not himself divine in early Sumerian thought, though later rulers would sometimes claim divine status or be deified after death. Instead, the king was understood as the earthly representative of the divine realm, chosen by the gods to exercise authority over human affairs on their behalf. His legitimacy derived from divine selection, from the fact that kingship had descended from heaven as a sacred gift and had been entrusted to him as steward of this divine institution. This explains the formula appearing repeatedly throughout the Sumerian king list, with its almost liturgical repetition. After the flood swept over the earth, after the catastrophe had ended the Antediluvian age, kingship descended from heaven once again, and the kingship was established in Kish, the first city to receive this divine gift in the post-flood world. This wasn't describing a literal physical descent of some object or person from the sky. It was expressing the theological principle that political authority had divine origins, that the right to rule came from the gods rather than from human consent, military conquest, economic power, or any purely secular source. Of course, in actual historical practice, rulers gained and held power through very human means, including military force, political alliances, economic resources, and personal charisma or administrative competence. But the ideology of divine kingship provided religious legitimation for their authority, transforming political power from mere domination backed by force into sacred office backed by cosmic order. This legitimation was mutually beneficial, helping kings justify their authority while giving priests and temples powerful royal patrons who protected their interests and funded their operations. 30. The transition from myth to history. The Antediluvian kings, those 8 rulers with their impossibly long reigns totaling over 200 morphodion, as in 200 years, represented an ideal form of this divine kingship, according to Sumerian mythological thinking. They ruled in an age when the separation between heaven and earth was less absolute than it would later become, when gods and humans interacted more directly and frequently. These early kings were not fully human in the ordinary biological sense. They may have been understood as demigods, or as beings partaking of both divine and mortal natures, existing at the boundary between the two realms. Their extended lifespans, measured in thousands or tens of thousands of years, marked them as exceptional, as fundamentally different from ordinary humans whose lives, even in the healthiest circumstances, rarely exceeded a century. They existed in a different temporal framework, experiencing time in ways that approached divine eternity rather than mortal transience. This difference wasn't merely quantitative, a matter of living longer. It was qualitative, reflecting their participation in divine nature, their special status as bridges between mortal and immortal realms. After the flood, kingship continued, but in a more recognizably human form. The post-flood kings in the Sumerian king list still reign for centuries rather than decades in many cases, with the first dynasty of Kish listing rulers, whose reigns total over 24,000 years combined, suggesting that the boundary between mythological and historical time remained fluid for several generations after the deluge. But gradually, as the king list progresses through successive dynasties ruling from various cities, the reign lengths become shorter, more plausible, more aligned with what we know about actual human lifespans, and with the archaeological record of real rulers whose monuments and inscriptions have been discovered. The transition is gradual rather than abrupt, with no clear moment when myth ends and history begins. Early post-flood dynasties include figures like Inana, who ascended to heaven on an eagle's back, and Gilgamesh, who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, and who ruled Uruk for 126 years. These are still mythological or legendary figures, heroes of epic tales rather than historical personages we can document through contemporary sources. But as we move later in the king list, we begin encountering names that can be correlated with archaeological evidence. Rulers mentioned in inscriptions they commissioned, kings whose monuments we can visit in museums, whose reigns we can date with reasonable confidence. This gradual transition from myth to history reflects how the Sumerians themselves understood their past, recognizing different categories of information and different degrees of certainty about events in different periods. 31. Debunking Sitchin. We must conclude, based on careful examination of what the Sumerian texts actually say when read in their original languages by qualified scholars, that the period before the Anunnaki, as described in ancient astronaut theory, never existed. The Anunnaki didn't come to Earth from somewhere else. They were born into the cosmos as it was being formed, emerging from the union of An and Ki, part of the divine genealogy from its early stages. They had specific roles within the cosmic order, important roles certainly, but they were not the creators or architects of that order. What actually came before, according to these ancient texts, was Nammu, the primordial sea, the birth of An and Ki from her waters, the separation of heaven and earth by Enlil, the proliferation of divine beings who took responsibility for maintaining existence, the creation of humanity from clay to serve as agricultural workers for the gods, the establishment of the first cities under divine patronage, the Antediluvian age with its impossibly long-lived kings representing a time when divine and human realms were closer, the flood that ended that age and established new conditions for post-Diluvian existence. This is what the Sumerian texts reveal. Not ancient astronauts, but ancient myths. Not genetic engineering, but clay moulded by divine hands. Not gold mining operations, but agricultural labour performed by humans to serve gods. Not extraterrestrial visitation, but theological reflection on the origins of existence and civilization. 32. Sitchin's fundamental errors. Let's examine the specific issues with Zechariah, Sitchin's work, and the ancient astronaut theory more broadly, because these issues completely undermine the credibility of the claims. First, the translation of Anunnaki itself. Sitchin claimed this word meant those who from heaven to earth came, suggesting extraterrestrial origins. But this translation is simply and demonstrably wrong. Every reputable Sumerian dictionary, from the comprehensive multi-volume Chicago Assyrian Dictionary to specialized lexicons of Sumerian terms, defines Anunnaki as deriving from elements meaning princely seed, offspring of An, or something closely equivalent. The term refers to their status as descendants of An, the sky god, born into the cosmos through natural divine reproduction, rather than arriving from outside it. This isn't a matter of scholarly interpretation or theoretical framework. It's basic linguistics, straightforward etymology that any competent student of Sumerian could verify by consulting standard reference works. Sitchin either fundamentally misunderstood how Sumerian grammar and word formation work, or he deliberately mistranslated the term to support his predetermined conclusion about ancient astronauts. Second, the claim about gold mining. According to Sitchin, the Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki coming to Earth specifically to mine gold, engaging in extensive mining operations that required the creation of human workers to perform the back-breaking labour. However, when we search the actual Sumerian corpus, when we examine the thousands of texts available in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature and in published collections of Sumerian compositions, we find absolutely no references to gods mining gold. Zero. None. The word gold appears in Sumerian texts, certainly, as it does in texts from any culture that knew and valued this precious metal, but always in contexts related to temple decoration, royal treasuries, divine statues, offerings to the gods, not to mining operations conducted by the gods themselves. Sitchin never provided a specific textual citation, never pointed to a particular line in a particular tablet that describes gods engaged in mining precious metals. He mentioned titles and phrases like Bel Ilimiki, which he translated as Lord of Mining, and claimed was a title of Ea or Enki. But there is absolutely no justification for this translation anywhere in Sumerian or Akkadian lexicography. Scholars who actually read these languages confirm that Sitchin appears to have simply invented this title or so, grossly mistranslated an actual phrase that it bears no relationship to what the text actually says. Third, the interpretation of Sumerian art and iconography. Sitchin and his followers point to various cylinder seals, those small carved stones that Mesopotamians rolled across wet clay to create distinctive images and marks, and to relief carvings on temple walls and palace gates, claiming these depict the Anunnaki in spacesuits, showing rocket ships launching from Earth, illustrating solar systems with extra planets including Nibiru. But actual archaeologists and art historians who have devoted their careers to studying Mesopotamian visual culture, who understand the symbolic language and iconographic conventions of ancient Near Eastern art, identify these images very differently and more accurately. The winged discs that appear frequently in Mesopotamian art, for instance, which Sitchin interpreted as spacecraft or flying vehicles, actually represent specific deities, particularly solar gods like Shamash in Akkadian tradition or Utu in Sumerian. The wings symbolise the god's ability to move across the sky, to bring light from horizon to horizon, to witness everything that happens under heaven. They're symbolic representations of divine power and presence, not technical drawings of vehicles. The horned crowns worn by divine figures in Sumerian art, which some ancient astronaut theorists have suggested might represent helmets or technological headgear, are actually standard symbols of divinity, marking figures as gods in a visual language that every Mesopotamian viewer would have immediately understood. One particularly famous example, cited repeatedly in ancient astronaut literature, is a cylinder seal known to scholars as VA-243, currently housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. Sitchin interpreted this seal as showing our solar system with all known planets, plus an additional large planet, Nibiru, depicted between Jupiter and Mars. This seal, according to Sitchin and his followers, proved that the ancient Sumerians possessed knowledge of the entire solar system, including outer planets like Uranus and Neptune that weren't discovered by modern astronomy until the 18th and 19th centuries. Knowledge that could only have come from extraterrestrial visitors who travelled through space and mapped the solar system. However, actual analysis of this seal by Assyriologists who read these images fluently reveals that the symbols Sitchin interpreted as planets are almost certainly stars. Following standard Mesopotamian iconographic conventions, where 8-pointed or multi-pointed star shapes represent stars or stellar deities. The large central circle that Sitchin identified as the sun is probably a deity or a symbolic representation of divine authority or kingship, not an astronomical body. The arrangement of these symbols follows theological and hierarchical logic rather than astronomical observation. This is not speculation or theoretical interpretation. This is straightforward reading of well-understood visual conventions by experts who have studied thousands of similar seals and images. 33. The Nibiru problem. Fourth, and perhaps most damaging to Sitchin's credibility and to the ancient astronaut theory he promoted, is the planet Nibiru itself. Sitchin claimed, based on his interpretations of Mesopotamian astronomical texts, that the Sumerians and later Babylonians knew about this additional massive planet in our solar system, a body with an orbit so eccentric that it spends most of its time in the outer reaches of the solar system, but periodically swings close to Earth every 3,600 years. This orbital period, according to Sitchin, explained various periodic catastrophes in Earth's history and correlated with major developments in human civilization. But astronomers and astrophysicists have pointed out numerous insurmountable problems with this planetary scenario. A planet with the mass and orbital characteristics that Sitchin described would be gravitationally unstable in the solar system. Its passage through the inner solar system every few thousand years would cause massive disruptions to the orbits of the known planets, perturbations that we would clearly see in their orbital mechanics. Jupiter's orbit would show effects from repeated close encounters with such a massive body. Earth's orbit would be affected. We would see clear evidence in the structure and dynamics of the asteroid belt, in the orbits of comets, in countless ways. But we don't see any such evidence. Moreover, if Nibiru existed with the characteristics Sitchin claimed, modern telescopes and space probes would have detected it by now. We've surveyed the sky extensively using instruments far more powerful than anything available when Sitchin was writing in the 1970s and 80s. We've identified countless distant objects in our solar system, including dwarf planets like Eris and Makemake in the Kuiper Belt, far beyond Pluto, objects much smaller and more distant than Nibiru would be during most of its orbit. We've tracked near-Earth asteroids, monitored comets, mapped the distribution of bodies throughout the solar system. If Nibiru existed, we would know about it. The absence of any such detection, despite decades of intensive astronomical observation using increasingly sophisticated instruments, is absolutely telling. NASA and other major space agencies have explicitly stated multiple times that there is no evidence whatsoever for the existence of Nibiru or Planet X as described by Sitchin. They have addressed this topic directly because the Nibiru theory has been so popular that it generated public inquiries and concerns, particularly around the year 2012, when some Sitchin followers predicted Nibiru would make a close pass by Earth, causing catastrophic destruction. No such event occurred, of course, because Nibiru doesn't exist. But the fact that respected scientific institutions felt compelled to issue public statements debunking this theory demonstrates how widely Sitchin's ideas have spread despite their lack of scientific foundation. Sitchin's hypothesis requires us to believe that ancient Sumerians, living 4,000 years ago, possessed detailed knowledge about a planet that remains invisible to our most sophisticated modern instruments, that they had access to information about the solar system that we, with all our telescopes and space probes and astronomical databases, still cannot verify. This is not merely implausible. It is a claim that contradicts everything we know about how knowledge is acquired, how observations are made, how information accumulates over time through systematic investigation. 34. The real value of Sumerian texts. Now, does all of this mean that the Sumerian texts are merely myth in the pejorative sense? That they hold no value? That they're nothing but primitive superstitions that modern people should dismiss as irrelevant? Absolutely not. And this is a crucial point that often gets lost in the debates between ancient astronaut enthusiasts and their critics. The value of the Sumerian texts lies in what they actually say, in the sophisticated theological and philosophical thinking they preserve, in the window they provide into how early Mesopotamian cultures understood the world, not in what modern theorists wish they said or claim they say beneath layers of supposed code and hidden meaning. The Sumerian creation myths describe a graduated cosmology, a universe that came into being through recognizable stages, moving from the primordial waters of Nammu through the separation of heaven and earth by Enlil, from the birth of the first generation of gods to the proliferation of divine beings who took responsibility for various aspects of existence, from the creation of humanity to serve the gods to the establishment of civilization under divine oversight. They portray gods who were not distant and removed from the world but actively involved in its operation, establishing order where chaos threatened, assigning responsibilities to ensure cosmic maintenance, ensuring that the structures of existence functioned properly. These gods, as the texts repeatedly show, had personalities as complex as any humans. They made mistakes, acting impulsively or without full knowledge of consequences. They engaged in contests and conflicts with each other, competing for authority or prestige or resources. They felt emotions ranging from love to jealousy to rage. They occasionally acted vindictively, punishing humans or other gods who offended them. They were divine, certainly, possessing powers far beyond human capabilities, but they were also characterizable, recognizable as persons rather than abstract forces, reflecting human psychology projected onto the cosmic stage. 35. Understanding civilization's origins. The texts also reveal how the Sumerians understood their own civilization, the unprecedented urban culture they had created in the flat plains of Mesopotamia. They saw it not as a purely human achievement emerging from our species' innate capabilities, but as fundamentally dependent on divine gifts, on knowledge and techniques that had been granted by the gods rather than discovered through human ingenuity alone. kingship descended from heaven rather than evolving from tribal leadership structures. Agriculture and animal husbandry were presented by divine beings like Ashnan and Lahar rather than developed through millennia of experimentation. Writing, that revolutionary technology that allowed the Sumerians to record these very texts we're discussing, was understood as a divine invention, attributed to gods rather than credited to human scribes. This wasn't primitive superstition or failure to understand causation. It was a sophisticated theological framework for understanding the origins of civilization and acknowledging that civilizational development depended on accumulated knowledge passed down through generations, on techniques that had to be learned and refined, on cultural inheritance that each generation received from those who came before. By attributing these foundational technologies to divine origins, the Sumerians were emphasizing their sacred importance, marking them as essential to human flourishing, protecting them from casual abandonment or thoughtless modification. 36. The Liminal Antediluvian Age. The Antediluvian period described in the Sumerian king list, with its 8 impossibly long-lived kings ruling over 5 sacred cities, represents, in this cosmological framework, a liminal time in cosmic history. An era when the boundaries between divine and human realms were less rigid than they would later become, when rulership could be exercised by god-like beings who lived for thousands of years because they partook of divine nature in ways that later humans would not. This was a golden age in some respects, a time of close divine-human interaction when the gods walked more directly among mortals, when revelations and miracles were commonplace rather than rare. But it was also fundamentally unstable. This age of close contact ultimately ended by divine decree, through the catastrophe of the flood that swept away the antediluvian world. The flood narrative, when we examine it carefully in all its surviving versions and variations, reveals several absolutely crucial aspects of the Sumerian worldview that predate and provide essential context for any interpretation involving the Anunnaki or other divine beings. First, it shows a complex divine hierarchy characterized by disagreement and debate rather than unified purpose. The cosmos was governed not by a single omnipotent deity whose will was absolute and unchallengeable, but by a council or assembly of gods who made decisions through discussion and voting, who could disagree with each other about appropriate courses of action, who could even work to undermine each other's decisions when they felt strongly enough about an issue. Individual deities like Enki could and did subvert the decisions of this divine assembly when they believed those decisions were wrong or unjust, working around the edges of divine law to achieve outcomes they preferred. This portrayal of gods as operating within constraints, as bound by precedents and procedures, as unable to simply do whatever they wished at any moment, reflects a sophisticated theological understanding. The divine realm had its own rules and structures, its own hierarchies and limitations. The gods were tremendously powerful compared to humans certainly, possessing abilities that mortals could barely comprehend, but they were not omnipotent in an absolute sense. Second, the flood story demonstrates that humanity in Sumerian thought existed at the pleasure of the gods, created to serve divine purposes, useful as long as they performed their designated roles, but potentially disposable if they became problematic from the divine perspective. Humans were neither purely good nor purely evil in this theological framework. They weren't moral agents whose ultimate fate depended on their ethical choices. They were servants whose continuation depended on their utility, on whether they served the purposes for which they had been created without causing unacceptable disruption to divine peace. Their fate was determined not by their individual moral qualities, but by their collective impact on the cosmic order and on divine comfort. This is a very different understanding of the divine-human relationship than what we find in later monotheistic traditions, where moral behaviour determines ultimate destiny, and where God's relationship with humanity involves covenants and promises based on mutual obligations. Third, the narrative shows that catastrophe in Sumerian cosmology could be both cosmic in scope and survivable through proper preparation guided by divine favour. The flood was universal in its impact within the known world, destroying all the cities of civilization, wiping away everything that humanity had built. But it was also survivable for those who had divine protection and who took appropriate precautions. This reflects the real historical experience of the Mesopotamian peoples who lived in a flood-prone environment where devastating inundations could destroy years of agricultural work and require complete rebuilding of settlements. The mythological flood elevated this recurring natural disaster to cosmic and theological significance, making it an event that shaped divine human relations and that marked a boundary between two fundamentally different ages of existence. 37. Why the ancient astronaut theory persists. But we must ask ourselves, why has this narrative been so successful? Why does it continue to attract believers and defenders, even when experts repeatedly explain its fundamental errors and misrepresentations? Part of the answer lies in the difficulty of accessing the actual Sumerian texts for most people. These are written in a dead language using a complex writing system, preserved on fragile clay tablets scattered across museums worldwide. Most people lack the training to read Sumerian cuneiform, and must depend on translations. And translations always involve interpretation, choices about rendering ambiguous phrases, decisions about filling gaps where texts are damaged. This situation creates opportunities for alternative interpretations, for claims that mainstream scholars are missing or deliberately obscuring the real meaning of the texts. It allows theorists like Sitchin to position themselves as possessing special insight, as seeing truths that conventional academics refuse to acknowledge. The fact that actual Sumerologists and Assyriologists have thoroughly debunked Sitchin's translations doesn't carry much weight with people who are predisposed to distrust academic authorities, or who find the ancient astronaut narrative more compelling than conventional scholarly interpretations. There's also undeniable appeal to the ancient astronaut idea itself, beyond questions of textual accuracy or scholarly consensus. The notion that intelligent extraterrestrial beings visited Earth in antiquity, that they created or modified humanity through advanced technology, that they imparted knowledge and capabilities that humans couldn't have developed independently. This offers something that conventional archaeology and history do not. It suggests we're not alone in the universe, that contact with alien intelligence has already occurred in our deep past. It implies that human achievements might be less impressive than we think, because we owe our civilization to outside intervention. There's an element of anti-establishment appeal as well. The ancient astronaut theory positions itself against mainstream academia, suggesting that conventional scholars are either too closed-minded to see the truth or actively suppressing it to protect their authority and paradigms. This narrative resonates with people who feel alienated from established institutions, who are skeptical of expert authority, who want to believe in hidden truths that the powerful won't acknowledge. It offers a counter-narrative that challenges official history, that suggests the past is more mysterious and exciting than the boring stories scholars tell. 38. The truth is more fascinating, but the reality, as we've seen through extensive examination of what the Sumerian texts actually say, is less dramatic than the ancient astronaut theory suggests, but far more interesting when we understand it properly. The Sumerian texts don't describe extraterrestrial visitation or advanced technology. When professional scholars who have devoted decades to learning these ancient languages examine the tablets, applying rigorous philological methods, checking their interpretations against vast databases of lexical evidence, considering linguistic details, grammatical structures, cultural contexts, and comparative evidence from the broader ancient Near Eastern world, what they find are sophisticated mythological narratives, complex theological systems, profound reflections on creation and human existence, extraordinary literary achievements, but no descriptions of extraterrestrial visitation or advanced technology. The Sumerian texts reveal a people who thought deeply and creatively about their place in the cosmos, who wondered about the origins of the world and of human civilization, who developed elaborate narratives to explain how reality came to be structured the way they experienced it. They created rich mythological traditions that influenced later Mesopotamian cultures, and, through various channels, contributed to the religious and literary heritage of the broader ancient Near East and eventually Western civilization. These texts deserve to be read and appreciated for what they actually say, for the genuine insights they offer into ancient thought and culture, not for what modern theorists wish they said or claim they say when properly decoded. 39. The pattern of divine action. What the texts consistently show us is a pattern of divine action that unfolds across cosmic time. In the beginning, there was only Nammu, the primordial ocean, pure potential waiting to actualize. From her essence emerged An and Kai, heaven and earth, locked in unified embrace. Their son Enlil violently separated them, creating the space where existence could flourish. The air, the atmosphere, the realm of life. From these primordial deities came successive generations of gods, each with their own domains and responsibilities. Nana ruled the moon, marking the passage of time. Utu governed the sun, bringing light and justice. Inana embodied both love and warfare, creation and destruction, the dual nature of existence itself. The lesser gods laboured to maintain cosmic order, digging canals and building foundations, until their complaints reached Nammu and Enki. The solution was humanity, beings crafted from primordial clay infused with divine essence, created to serve the gods through agricultural labour and temple maintenance. The first cities were founded under divine patronage. Kingship descended from heaven as a sacred gift. The me, those fundamental principles of civilized existence, were distributed among the gods and transmitted to humanity. In the Antediluvian age, godlike kings ruled for impossibly long periods, existing at the boundary between mortal and divine, presiding over a world where the barriers between realms were more permeable than they would later become. But humanity multiplied too successfully, filling the world with noise that disturbed divine peace. Enlil decreed their destruction through a great flood. Enki, cleverer and more sympathetic to humanity, subverted this decree by warning Ziusudra and enabling him to build a boat and preserve the seed of civilization. After the flood, new limitations were imposed on humanity. Mortality became absolute. Lifespans were shortened. Fertility was regulated, all to prevent human population from again growing so large that divine tranquility would be threatened. The post-flood world was the world the Sumerians knew, a world where humans still served the gods through temple offerings and agricultural labour, where cities thrived under divine protection, where kings ruled with heavenly mandates, but where the close intimacy between divine and human realms that characterized the Antediluvian age was gone, replaced by more formal and distant relations mediated through priests and rituals. 40. The Anunnaki's place. And the Anunnaki. They appear in these narratives not as the primary creators or the architects of civilization, but as members of a later divine generation, as judges of the dead, as the seven who decree fates in the underworld. They were important gods within the complex Sumerian pantheon, certainly. They wielded real power in their specific domain. But they were not the beginning of the story. They were not the extraterrestrial miners and genetic engineers of ancient astronaut theory. They were chthonic deities associated with the realm of death, with the inexorable fate awaiting all mortals, with the ultimate judgment that even great goddesses like Inana had to face when they descended to the land of no return. The obsession with the Anunnaki in modern popular culture, the tendency to see them as the central figures in Mesopotamian mythology, rather than as one group among many in a complex pantheon, stems almost entirely from Sitchin's work and the interpretive framework he created. By focusing attention on this particular group of gods and interpreting them through the lens of ancient astronaut theory, he created a narrative that has proven remarkably persistent despite its complete lack of scholarly support and despite the overwhelming evidence against it from actual specialists in Sumerian language and culture. So, what came before the Anunnaki narrative as promoted in ancient astronaut theory? The truth, according to the actual Sumerian texts, when we read them carefully and honestly, before the Anunnaki occupied their role as judges of the dead, there was the creation and organization of the cosmos by earlier divine generations. Before humans were supposedly genetically engineered by extraterrestrials to mine gold, there was the fashioning of humanity from primordial clay to serve as agricultural workers for gods. Before ancient astronauts allegedly descended from Nibiru, there was Nammu generating An and Ki from her own essence, and Enlil separating heaven from earth to create the space where life could exist. Before gold mining operations, there was the establishment of agriculture and animal husbandry as divine gifts, lifting humanity from primitive subsistence to civilized abundance. Before spacecraft and advanced technology, there was the me, those fundamental principles of civilized existence, transmitted from divine realm to human world through clever negotiation, divine favor, and sometimes outright theft. Before alien genetic laboratories, there was the experimental creation process where Enki and Ninmah worked through trial and error to discover the proper form and function for human beings. Before interstellar travel, there was the Antediluvian age when godlike kings with impossibly long lifespans ruled the first cities, when boundaries between divine and human realms were more permeable than they would later become. Before a planet on a 3,600-year elliptical orbit, there was the three-tiered cosmos of heaven, earth, and underworld, with the Abzu beneath and multiple layers of heaven above. Before catastrophe caused by planetary collisions, there was the flood, divine judgment motivated by human noise disturbing divine sleep, survived by one righteous man who preserved the seed of civilization in a great boat. This is what the Sumerian texts actually tell us. Not science fiction masquerading as archaeology, but sophisticated mythology reflecting deep theological and philosophical thought about creation, civilization, and humanity's place in the cosmic order. These texts, pressed into wet clay by ancient scribes over 4,000 years ago, preserved against all odds through millennia of war and conquest and environmental decay, translated by dedicated scholars who devoted their lives to recovering these lost voices, deserve better than to be twisted beyond recognition to support modern theories about ancient astronauts. They deserve to be heard in their own voice, speaking their own truths about how one of humanity's earliest civilizations understood the cosmos and their place within it. The Sumerians looked at the world around them, the rivers that brought life-giving water and catastrophic floods, the cycles of seasons marked by celestial movements, the hard work of agriculture that sustained their cities, the complex social hierarchies that organised their society, and they created narratives explaining how all of this came to be. They attributed the origins of civilization to divine gifts because they understood, in their own way, that civilizational knowledge is inherited rather than innate, that each generation stands on the shoulders of those who came before, that the techniques and technologies making urban life possible had to be learned and transmitted across time. They told stories of gods who were powerful but not omnipotent, who made mistakes and argued with each other, and sometimes acted from petty motivations, because this reflected their understanding that the cosmos was complex and sometimes contradictory, that reality didn't always operate according to simple moral principles. They preserved memories of catastrophic floods that destroyed cities and required survivors to rebuild from scratch, because such disasters were real events in Mesopotamian history, traumatic experiences that shaped cultural memory for generations. They imagined an antediluvian golden age, when kings lived for thousands of years and gods walked more directly among mortals, because every culture has its myths of a lost paradise, a time before the present age when things were different and perhaps better. And they assigned the Anunnaki to their proper role as judges of the dead, as authorities over the ultimate boundary that all life must cross, because death was, as it still is, the great mystery, the inexorable fate awaiting every mortal, the transition that required divine oversight and judgment. If you found value in this exploration of what the Sumerian texts actually reveal about the period before historical memory and before modern reinterpretations, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content that examines ancient mysteries with intellectual honesty, scholarly rigour, and genuine respect for the evidence. Share your thoughts in the comments about what aspects of Sumerian mythology you find most fascinating or challenging. Where are you tuning in from tonight? What drew you to this topic? I love hearing from everyone who joins these journeys into the ancient past, learning what questions you bring and what perspectives you hold. The ancient Sumerians left us an incredible legacy, not of alien contact or advanced technology, but of sophisticated theological thinking, remarkable literary achievement, and profound reflection on the deepest questions of human existence. They were the first to write down their understanding of how the world came to be, the first to systematically record their religious beliefs and mythological traditions, the first to preserve for future generations the stories that gave meaning to their lives. That legacy deserves our respect and our careful attention. It deserves to be understood on its own terms, rather than filtered through modern agendas and sensationalist reinterpretations. The truth about what came before the Anunnaki narrative is not as dramatic as ancient astronaut theory suggests, but it is far more fascinating when we take the time to understand it properly. To see the Sumerians not as primitive people recording garbled memories of alien contact, but as thoughtful human beings grappling with the same questions about origins and meaning that we still ask today. Their answers were different from ours, shaped by their own cultural context and worldview, but they were genuine answers, sincere attempts to make sense of existence, worthy of our serious consideration and appreciation. Until next time, may your path through history's deepest mysteries be illuminated by curiosity, guided by critical thinking, and enriched by authentic wonder at what our ancestors actually achieved and actually believed. The clay tablets are still speaking, if we're willing to listen to what they actually say.